Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. I promised Greg I wouldn't get him aggregated by TMZ when we did the podcast today, but it's okay. We'll soldier on. We are continuing our team.
Well,
previews.
we haven't. Well, who knows? Maybe I'll piss someone off with what I say. You never know.
Well, I hope it goes better for you, Greg, than it did for me. But that's all well and done. And had a good talk with Jeffrey Simmons this morning. So we move on as training camp continues, and our team series previews continues as we get closer to football. In fact, there will be a preseason game, the first preseason game played tomorrow, and we always approach this approach the preseason games more specifically looking at players, Greg, than we do obviously at any kind of scheme or lack thereof that they might be running. Any players that you're intrigued to see potentially? I know Caleb Williams isn't going to play, nor CJ Stroud. Is there anybody in particular?
You're talking about tomorrow night's game?
Anybody at all?
Well, who's Chicago playing? I haven't
Chicago and the Texans. Well, this is the thing. It's preseason football, so it doesn't really matter. But it's Chicago and the Texans, and who they might actually trot out there remains.
It's so funny. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people think because of what I do, and I do love football, obviously, that I get so excited for a preseason game, but I just don't. So I was being honest when I said who are the Bears playing. I knew the Bears were playing tomorrow night because the Bears are what we're doing here at NFL Films for Hard Knocks. So I know that the Bears are playing tomorrow night. But to be honest with you, until you said that, I did not know who they were playing.
That's okay. I had to double check to make sure I was right. There's football and then there's preseason football. They're not the same thing.
Right. And it's funny, just to make one quick comment about what you said about preseason, and I know that it'll be different with the Titans this year because Coach Callahan has indicated that he will play starters. I think what let's just look at the offense for a minute. So what you're looking for is execution of basic concepts. Obviously, you're not game planning. You're not looking to do a lot of different things. You're taking your base concepts and you want to see them executed properly. That's what you're looking for. You're not trying to match up to the opponent. You're not thinking, oh, it's 2nd and 8. They're going to do this. You're not doing any of that. You're just running your core staple concepts and trying to execute them well. And then if you do that, you come away from the game and go, nice job. Yep. But that's really what you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk more specifically about individual players in the Titans preseason, obviously, once that rolls around.
Once they start, which will be next week, right? Next week
against San Francisco. So there are some interesting players on both sides worth documenting, but certainly we'll focus on the Titan side of things and do a little team preview there as well. So today, the Washington Commanders, as interestingly constructed a team as any that is out there this offseason, Greg. But Jayden Daniels, and I know Dan Quinn has said that he's not just going to give Jayden Daniels the starting quarterback job. He would like there to be some competition, even though they drafted.
Even though Jayden Daniels will be given the starting quarterback job.
One would imagine. I've seen the Marcus Mariota experience, Greg. I don't necessarily think that Washington Commander fans have anything to fear there. But from a prospect standpoint, we did talk about Jayden Daniels in the lead-up. Him working in Washington and with what they have around him, which we'll talk more about in just a little bit. I am so fascinated to see what they do and how they use him because he is one of the most electrifying athletes that I've seen in college football.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really stood out watching his tape, and I watched extensive tape from his last 2 seasons at LSU, was how he grew as a patient pocket player. We know he's a dynamic runner, and he'll do that, and I'm sure they'll even give him some design runs, but they won't overdo that simply because of his body type. He's not a big kid like Josh Allen, where you feel that it's okay if he takes some shots. You don't really want that with Jayden Daniels, but they'll have a mixture offensively because it's Cliff Kingsberry, and I know people probably think of him as an air raid guy, which of course is his background, and they think spread offense, and they'll do some of that. But people have to also remember that Kingsberry, when he was in Arizona, because they did not have really quality wideouts, he went a lot with 2 tight ends, at times with 3 tight ends. So he's kind of learned the NFL that you have to play to what your talent level is. And right now, and we'll get back to Daniels in a sec, but right now there's uncertainty as to who their number 3 wide receiver would be. So that's a training camp issue for them that they have to work through. They obviously have Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, but the third wideout is a little unknown right now. They did draft Luke McCaffrey in the third round. I'm sure they'd love to see him become that guy, but you don't know. He's a rookie. So we'll see. But Jayden Daniels, as I said, getting back to him, I thought his growth as a patient pocket player was really, really impressive. As dynamic a runner as he is, Buck, he didn't just take off and run. I mean, you live in SEC country, so I'm sure you saw him play a lot of football games. He was a pretty poised guy. I mean, he threw the ball from the pocket and he made the kinds of throws on tape as I watched and I think I watched 8 or 9 games of 2023 and probably 8 or 9 games last summer of 2022. And he made NFL throws. He made window throws versus zone. When it was one-on-one, he threw the ball, which is what you have to do in the NFL. And he made some difficult throws. Now, does he have a gun? No. And were there some deep balls that kind of lost a little energy at times? Yeah. But in the short to intermediate areas, he threw the ball really, really well.
Was he ever on your radar when he was at Arizona State, Greg?
Well, I very much knew about him after his freshman year because he had a great freshman year. And some might remember that his wide receiver that year was Brandon Ayuk when he was a freshman at ASU. And he was talked about as the next guy because he was a big time recruit. He's from Southern California and he's good buddies with CJ Stroud and Bryce Young. They're kind of all in that group. They're all good friends. And so he was viewed as, hey, the next guy. And then, of course, we know Arizona State had all kinds of problems that went way beyond Jayden Daniels.
Right.
And he ended up at LSU. And that first year in 2022, I think there was uncertainty as to what he was. But he ended up having a really nice season and then, of course, had the great season last year.
En route to winning the Heisman Trophy last year.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Cliff Kingsbury, and Cliff comes back to the NFL after spending some time in college working at USC. And I like the way that you kind of contextualize it, Greg. And when we talk about these coaches and schemes that they run, I do think that people get it set in their heads too often. I've talked about this on the radio show with Denard Wilson about, all right, where did they just come from? That's what they're going to run here. And that's hardly ever the case for these coaches who have so many diverse backgrounds.
And it's a great point about Kingsbury because teams tell you very often how they see themselves by what they do in the draft or free agency and keep in mind they signed Zach Ertz. Now he's closer to the end than the beginning, but they obviously signed him believing that he can still play meaningful snaps. But then they drafted Ben Sinnott in the second round from Kansas State. Now you don't draft that kid in the second round to play 5 snaps a game. Right. I mean, he's a second round pick and he's a good prospect. I think he's more of a second type tight end than a lead tight end in today's NFL. But that tells you that they do plan on playing a meaningful number of snaps out of 12 personnel, meaning 1 back and 2 tight ends, or they would not have drafted that kid in the second round.
Right. On the defensive side of the ball, and you mentioned the wide receivers, they have Olamide Zaccheaus, who I know was in Philadelphia for a while, who was how would you define him, Greg, or describe him, I guess, rather as a functional 3?
Yeah, I think you want him more potentially maybe as a return man to play occasionally on offense, but I think you want a little more from your number 3 than Zaccheaus gives you. Dyami Brown's been there since 2021 as a 3rd round pick out of North Carolina, played with Sam Howell. And he never has quite become what they thought he'd be. But he gets another shot under a new coaching staff. That's the thing. You now have a new coaching staff. Byron Pringle's a guy out of Kansas State a number of years ago who's been around the league a bit. He always seems to show up at times, and he's probably a number 3 type. So we'll see how it all plays out. But again, they drafted Luke McCaffrey in the 3rd round. I did him as well, watched his tape. Very tough kid, as you would expect, being McCaffrey. Only has played receiver for a couple of years, but really has when he knew that contact was coming, he caught the ball. I mean, he's a tough physical kid, worked between the numbers really well in college. I'm sure drafting him in the 3rd round, given that he does not have a ton of experience as a receiver, they would love for him to be the number 3. They also have a free agent who I found really interesting watching his tape, and I think he was a draftable player, and he played at Georgia. So obviously he's played in big-time games, and that's Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. And I thought he was worthy of being drafted. And the reason I'm sure he wasn't is he didn't run a good 40 time, but he played faster when you watched his tape at Georgia. So I'm curious to see, hey, he's a free agent. It's possible he doesn't even make the team, Buck. I'm just saying that, there's a guy that kind of stood out to me. I think he's going to end up somewhere in the National Football League.
Yeah, I'm just so curious with the running backs that they have in Brian Robinson, with Eckler, with Jayden Daniels, and all that he offers in that wide receiver core. Just exactly how they're going to deploy him and how this offense is going to run. It's going to be
And if we could just finish up with their offense, that's a great point you just made because they don't have a dynamic back. They have grinders and sustainers. So, they could line up in 12 personnel and try to sustain it, take some pressure off Daniels. They don't want him dropping back 40 times a game. All their backs are somewhat similar. Robinson is I like Robinson, but he's a grinder. Even Chris Rodriguez, who got some meaningful snaps a year ago, you remember him from Kentucky when Will Levis was there a couple of years ago, had the big year. He's that same kind of back. Eckler is kind of that kind of back now, later in his career. He's a very good receiver as well.
So to the defensive side of the ball, where Joe Witt Jr. is the coordinator, the interior of the defensive line continues to be kind of what their bread and butter is, right? They've got 2 first-round picks, former first-round picks, in Deron Payne and Jonathan Allen, obviously. Traded away Montez Sweat last year. He'll be on the Titans' Week 1 opponent in the Chicago Bears. They have Clelin Ferrell, who never really lived up to the draft pedigree where Oakland took him at the time. Oakland took him in the first round, but just kind of this defense in general. It's the whole team, Greg. I come away looking at this roster and just in my head, I'm thinking, I'm not sure what they're going to do, but I'm intrigued by all of it. I know that's kind of a general setup for you, but
No, and it's fine. There's a lot to say about it, and we don't know. It'll be Dan Quinn's defense, even though they have, a different coordinator. And so there's a couple of questions here. Dan Quinn, when he was in Dallas, they played a ton of what we call big nickel with 3 safeties. I think they had the lowest percentage the last 2 years in the NFL of playing with 3 linebackers, quote unquote base defense. So their base defense was really big nickel. Now, they drafted Mike Sainristil in the second round,
right.
and he's a really good prospect from Michigan. Really like the way this kid plays. It reminded me kind of Mike Hilton at times, and Mike Hilton's a really good slot corner. But they also have players that they can play big nickel if they choose to. They have, Jeremy Chin they signed. Derek Forrest has turned out to be kind of a nice player for them. They've got Quan Martin, who's a second-year player from Illinois, who was a second-round pick, obviously not by Dan Quinn, but Quan Martin played 3 different positions at Illinois. He played safety, slot corner, and outside corner. So if he chooses to play snaps of big nickel, Quan Martin could certainly be the 3rd safety. Even Percy Butler, who's been there, has played a lot of safety. So, we're uncertain at this point. We don't know what they're going to do as far as their base defense. You mentioned Clelin Ferrell. He was the 4th pick in a draft. Unfortunately, he's not a pure pass rusher, so therefore he's not been viewed as really a good player.
Right.
But he was really good for San Francisco last year in doing the dirty work, setting the edge in the run game, being a run defender, not a pure pass rusher. But one signing they did make, well, 2 signings. We know about Bobby Wagner. Okay, he still had a nice year last year in Seattle. Assuming he can still play, that's always a good signing. But the guy that I've always loved on tape, one of my favorite guys on tape, I've talked about him for a number of years, totally overlooked because he's not a household name, is Frankie Louvu. I thought that was a really, really good signing for them.
We will see the Commanders. The Titans are at the Commanders on the first day of December, as a matter of fact. So perhaps we'll have significantly more answers there, provided that health holds up. But it'll be some time before that road game takes place. Just Bobby Wagner and kind of speaking to the year that he had last year, Greg, because the way that some of these defenders are able to sustain, and Bobby Wagner obviously not at the peak of his powers anymore, right? He has been an excellent player for a long time.
Pass coverage. He was a great pass coverage defender, and I don't think he's quite as good just because he doesn't move quite the same as he did, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, but when you talk to coaches, Greg, specifically, and they talk about those kind of veteran players that can come in and be an extension of the coaching staff on the field, that is what beyond, he's obviously going to be expected to play a meaningful role in that defense. But I have to imagine that having guys like Bobby Wagner around that way is exactly what Dan Quinn's trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and you never know why they brought him in. I mean, you mentioned one reason, which is a definite. But who knows? Maybe they brought him in because they still have Jamin Davis, who's really gifted physically, but it just hasn't, to use the cliche, the light has not gone on for him. Maybe they feel Wagner can help in that regard because Davis, you remember him, I'm sure, in college, another SEC player, 6'3", 235, looks the part as much as any linebacker in the league, and it just hasn't worked. For some reason, he doesn't see it the right way. Most defensive coaches, okay, I don't want to speak for all, but most defensive coaches would rather have players that they can absolutely trust and they know almost all the time will do the right thing and play the defense the right way than a superior athlete who might make a couple of great plays, but you just don't know if he's going to play the defense the right way.
Sure.
And, Wagner has certainly always been that guy, but at this point in his career, he's absolutely that guy. He will play the defense the right way. And you hit it right on the head, Buck. Dan Quinn can trust him. He can put him out there and know that he'll get everybody lined up the right way. He's seen everything. He'll recognize all the formations, the receiver splits. If the back is 6 yards behind the quarterback or 8 yards behind the quarterback, because that means things, he'll know all those things.
Well, I will look forward to wrapping up the NFC East next week with you, Greg, with the New York Giants, who have been the subject of the offseason with Hard Knocks going on. Some interesting conversations there. Are you a Hard Knocks person at all?
Do I work on it?
No. Are you a Hard Knocks person? Do you watch it?
I see bits and pieces of it, but no, I don't. I have not seen like every episode.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because at least for me, Greg, and you have a different level of access with a lot of these teams than I do, of course, but like to actually see the way that these front offices work, the draft meetings that they were showing, which is not something that we typically get to see. I have found it more interesting than your typical training camp.
Yeah, no, it's that stuff. And again, I love that stuff. I love hearing when I do talk to coaches about players, hear the way they talk, and because I'm obviously watching tape. As I told you before we started this, I've probably seen 140 players, of which 95% of them will be in next year's draft. Some always either come back or something happens. But I really enjoy that because you see a player now, and then he's got another year, and you kind of feel like, okay, what can he work on? Normally a guy's athletic traits don't really change. It's not like he's 15 years old and then he's going to be 20 years old. Once you're 19 or 20, normally the traits don't, really meaningfully change. A guy who's let's say doesn't play fast is not all of a sudden going to look like a dynamic athlete the next year. It doesn't. They can work on other things, but normally that doesn't change.
Right, absolutely, and that's why Greg's scouting notes are as thorough as they are. You guys have seen the profiles for yourself, especially if you've attended the live show where we had them on display. Greg, appreciate your time as always. And, I won't hold you to Hall of Fame game, but at some point we're going to have to talk about some players in some preseason football, bud.
No, yeah, but and certainly the Titans, especially since Coach Callahan said he's going to play guys. We'll have to do that. But of course, I'm going to be down there with you in a couple of weeks.
Can't wait. Seahawks joint camp. We'll have the Niners in town, then Seattle with Mike McDonald. There, you talk about competition and some interesting matchup opportunities there in that practice. I know we're looking forward to getting into it, and I know you're looking forward to catching up with some people to get a little more insights on how it is that these coaches get it done. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Buck.